Happy birthday, dear Jamie. Happy birthday to you. I may not be able to sing, but I sure can hike. Last June, I flew 3,600 miles and then walked over 100 miles to attend my friend's birthday party in Scotland. To get to the party, I hiked on Scotland's most popular and imminently doable long-distance trail that goes through multiple medieval villages and the sheep and cow-studded countryside. Stay tuned and you'll see why the West Highland Way Trail should be a consideration for your bucket list. Welcome to the Active Travel Adventures podcast, where we explore multi-day adventure travel from around the world. These aren't Everest crazy adventures. These are active vacations that anybody that keeps himself in decent shape can do. I'm your host, Kit Parks, and today let's hike the West Highland Way in Scotland. When Jamie, a Scot I met in Nicaragua, invited our hiking group to his 40th birthday party hike with he and his friends in Scotland, I jumped at the chance. How often do you get the opportunity to truly hang out like a local? You met Jamie in the Nicaragua episode number 1. He was the gent that danced with me in the town square. Jamie lives in Glasgow, and his birthday hiking weekend was going to be in Fort Williams, about 100 miles north. However, I couldn't rationalize flying across the pond for a 3-day weekend, so I figured that there must be something else cool I could do while I was over there. I did a quick Google search, and voila, Kismet! Scotland's most popular long-distance hike, the West Highland Way, goes from just outside Glasgow, where Jamie lives, and ends in Fort William, right where the party was. Plus, there's another trail, the Kelvin Walkway, that actually starts in Glasgow and ends at the beginning of the West Highland Way. So I was able to hike directly from my downtown Glasgow hotel all the way to the birthday party. The West Highland Way is a stunningly beautiful, moderately difficult hike through the western Scottish Highlands. About 85,000 people hike the 96-mile trail each year, taking anywhere from 4 to 10 days depending on their pace. I did it in just over a week. The trail is dotted with centuries-old villages, livestock, lakes, they're called lochs in Scotland, castle ruins, and gentle hills. I love to backpack, but I have to say that I have a new appreciation for doing a long-distance hike where you get to take a shower at the end of the day, have a cold brew, a hot dinner, and a cozy bed. Plus, this time I used a self-guided tour company, so my main luggage was transported each day to the next stop, so all I needed was my day pack. Sweet! So at 56 years old, I'm kind of sold on this new luxury. Leaving the city was more scenic than I expected. I had a little difficulty staying on the trail sometimes through the town, but found Charlie Laram's West Highland Way guide helpful, as the locals I asked in town didn't realize that there even was a trail. Locals not knowing about a trail is not as uncommon as you might think. There have been 2 times when I was in a trail town on the Appalachian Trail and couldn't find a local who even knew that the famous trail went right straight through their town. I never got seriously lost, but want to give accolades to one of, if not the single best guidebook I've ever bought. It not only tells you the nitty-gritty about hiking this trail, but also has color photos of the flora and fauna and great hand-drawn local don't miss this maps along with the official maps. The guidebook is put out by a company called Trailblazer, and they have guidebooks on dozens of long-distance hiking and cycling trails. Lately, I've been experimenting with not doing much, if any, research on the places I'm traveling to see if being surprised adds to the experience. This has been making it a bit more interesting. After booking this particular tour with zero knowledge of the landscape of Scotland, or frankly anything other than its starting and end point, I did ask my friend Jamie if I had inadvertently booked a technical hike. He assured me that they didn't have any dangerous or very high mountains in Scotland, and frankly, I was so busy with work, I did no further research before heading over. My tour company sent me the aforementioned guide along with a nice waterproof map, and God bless them for doing so, as it was so nice to have a decent reference to use for my adventure. I knew I wanted to start this podcast and had recently met Mike from mikesroadtrips.com. Got to check that out. And got to see him make all these cool videos with a drone and a GoPro with a gimbal. That's one of those things that makes video steady. I was like, oh, I got to get one of those. I had such visions of bringing you these cool videos from Scotland. Oh, well, it was so heavy. It came in just before my trip, and I really didn't have a chance to learn how to use it. So I carried this very heavy equipment with me and messed up my knee, which troubled me for much of this trip. I should have known better. I usually train before any adventure vacation. Not only did I not train, I was carrying way too much weight in my pack without any training. Lesson learned. Won't do that again. So back to the hike. As there are many towns along the way, you can do this adventure in a short period of time like my speedy new UK friend Simon, who blew through the trail in about 5 days and then went on to hike the Great Glenway Trail that runs from Fort Williams to Inverness, or take your time like I did. My average day was just under 13 miles a day, which is about how many miles I can do before my feet start to scream. The trail starts in, and I'm going to butcher this name, Milngavie, a name I never did learn how to pronounce. A granite obelisk denotes the start of the trail, and you start by walking under this big bronze West Highland Way overhead arch. The beginning of the trail is a relatively flat pathway through a beautiful woodland. It was a very meditative beginning to my first solo long-distance hike. I found it pretty easy going the first day. Most of the trail uses old drovers' paths, otherwise known as paths where the herders move the cattle and sheep. Also, the West Highland Way Trail uses old military and rail paths for many sections, so this really is a doable hike for anyone modestly fit. The first day's end finds me at the little town of Drymen. This quaint village of less than 1,000 people boasts Scotland's oldest pub. Again, I'm going to butcher it, the Clachan Pub. Clachan. Clachan Pub. While officially this pub's license states that it began operation in 1734, the local lore says otherwise. The pub serves Fraoch, Fraoch, I'm sorry, I don't speak Gaelic, a heather-based ale using a recipe that's over 4,000 years old. Drymen is also the western terminus of another long-distance hike in Scotland called the Rob Roy Way. Rob Roy, who died in 1734, was part of the Jacobite uprising and who in his lifetime became a folk hero. Locals say that Rob Roy's sister was once the landlady of the Clachan Pub. A recurring theme that you'll hear in the Active Travel Adventures podcast is that the exchanges with fellow travelers and locals that you meet in and on your travels become the bedrock of your favorite memories. After finishing my first day's hike, I arrived in Drymen before the rooms were ready. Sitting on the comfy lobby and warming up in front of the fire, even though it was June, I met an Australian named Russell and an expat American living in Canada named Linda. You bond so quickly when you're an adventure traveler, and the three of us not only kept up for the duration of our hike, but also thereafter. We know that whenever we are in each other's turf, that we'll reconnect. Russell and I ended up hiking together the next day to Ruardinen before taxiing back to Balmaha to sleep. Accommodations are very tight along the West Highland Way, so it's best to book early or to plan on camping. Frankly, even though at first I was disappointed that I wasn't able to get a room in the picturesque Ruardinen town, when Russell and I encountered our first midges while enjoying a post-hike beer outside the inn, it turned out to be a good thing. Midges are these super annoying, teeny tiny gnats that bite but mostly just drive you batty. Where I live in North Carolina, we have something similarly annoying that we call no-see-ums because they're so hard to see. I did pack netted headgear just in case the midges drove me crazy, but never had the need to put it on. In fact, the only time I had an issue with them was over that beer in Ruardinen. One reason June is a preferred month to hike the West Highland Way is because the midges aren't so bad then. Apparently they could be maddening later in the summer, but that's what the inexpensive head net is for. By now, Russell and I are hiking alongside the Loch Lomond, or Lake Lomond. The Queen Elizabeth Forest Park in the town of Balmaha has a spectacular overlook on Connick Hill. We were blessed with picture-perfect weather for the summit. Less than 100 people live in Balmaha, but it's a popular day trip from Glasgow due to its scenic beauty on Loch Lomond and the panoramic Connick Hill vista. While in Balmaha, you can take a ferry ride tour of the loch or over to Inchcailloch. The pub at the Oak Tree Inn, the only place in town to sleep, has twice won Scotland's Best Independent Pub Award. I thought the food was tasty too. Kudos for them, since they're the only place in town and they could get away with being awful. Speaking of summits, Scotland's mountains aren't overly tall. In Scotland, they call it hill walking. Most mountains aren't over 3,000 feet or 1,000 meters. However, there are some 283 over 1,000 meters, and many folks, like my Scottish friends Jamie and Julie, count these climbs. They call it Munro bagging, after the man who first counted them all. And speaking of Scots, going back to my first night in Scotland, I thought that something I learned from Jamie was interesting insight into the Scottish humor. When I flew into Glasgow, Jamie and I met for drinks and dinner. We had drinks at a new American bar that featured Pabst Blue Ribbon as the preferred American beer. I thought it was funny that this bar was using one of our cheapest beers to highlight American beer, and also profitably shrewd on the owner's part. On the way to dinner, we walked past the Gallery of Modern Art in the Royal Exchange Square. In front of the museum is a bronze statue of the first Duke of Wellington on a horse. On top of this august statue is a plastic orange traffic cone. Several decades ago, a prankster put a cone on his head. The locals decided that was art, so the cone gets replaced daily. The council is constantly taking it off, and one of the locals is putting another one back on. The city council says it spends over £10,000 a year on cone removal and was trying to raise the statue higher to prevent people from putting the cones back on. In 2011, Lonely Planet listed this tribute as one of the 10 most bizarre monuments on Earth. When word got out about the city council's plans to raise that statue, a Facebook Keep the Cone petition garnered over 72,000 likes in 24 hours. Not bad for a city with a population under 600,000. Despite the admonishments of the city council, Jamie says the locals feel that the plastic cone on top of that head is modern art and belongs in front of the Modern Art Gallery. Make sure you check out the photo of the statue on the website, activetraveladventures.com. It's a hoot. Now, back to the hike. While walking along the Lac Lemande, Russell and I were fortunate to witness a young couple getting ready to get married. We watched the wedding party, the handsome groomsmen in their cute kilts, make preparations for the ceremony along the waterfront. We were so tempted to stay for the ceremony. Gratefully, I'd booked a rest day in Balmaha, which gave my knee a bit of a respite. Not enough, I'm afraid, as the next day I had a 14-mile hike that was challenging, even though it wasn't killer. Yet it still took me, with my bad knee, 9 hours to hike the 14 miles to the Dryman Inn in Inverrahman. I'm so sorry I keep butchering these names. This happened to also be the most difficult day's hike of the entire trail, yet I'd still rank the difficulty level a 3.5 out of 5. There's some rock steps, so definitely there's more up and down stepping than the other days, but this is still an eminently doable hike. It was just really hard for me because of my knee. Overall, I would rate the whole West Highland Way hike maybe a 3 out of 5. I ended the day staying at the historic Dryman Inn. It's located at the northern end of the gorgeous Lac Lemande. All right, I know I was tired, I was thirsty, and I was just bushed. But the inn, which has its own charm and has been around for centuries, doesn't look like they've dusted the stuffed animal taxidermy trophies in a while, and they're everywhere. Nonetheless, I was so glad to get off my feet and was honored that Jamie and his mom drove up from Glasgow to join me for dinner and to see how I was doing. Our meals were pretty good and the service decent, and the ambiance was very festive. I just felt like breaking out a feather duster. My room was, shall we say, a bit retro. I was put in the newer building across the street. Based on the furnishings, I'd say it was last updated in the 1950s, although the baths looked newer. Still, I slept like an angel. The next day's hike seemed to be mostly level or uphill. Happily, my knee now only troubled me going downhill for some reason. Early in the hike, I met a really funny and charming man named Simon from England. He and I hiked together to my day's endpoint of Tyndrum, where Simon treated me to a lovely lunch. Afterwards, Speedy Simon hiked another 7 miles to the Bridge of Orchy. As a side note, after hiking the West Highland Way, Simon went on to hike yet another 73 more miles on the Great Glenway long-distance hike to Inverness. So this is an option for you overly ambitious hikers. There are loads of long-distance hikes in Scotland, many of them intersecting, so if you wanted to, you can hike for as long as you wish. Decision day. My knee was still troubling me, and I was scheduled to hike 20 miles today. Mind you, I'd only hiked 20 miles once in my life on the Appalachian Trail. Knowing that I was in for some unpleasant Scottish cold rain this day, I planned to start my hike at 5 o'clock in the morning. The weather was that nasty 40-degree, rain-shooting darts sideways, piercing into your eyeballs kind of rain. Dutifully, I set out for the Bridge of Orchy, 7 miles ahead, promptly at 5. It wasn't a difficult hike, but man was it cold. This is June. I had all the right gear, except my gloves were thermal and not waterproof, so I never even bothered to wear them. Simon had told me about waterproof gloves, but I hadn't yet found a store to buy a pair. By the time I reached Bridge of Orchy, my hands were like frozen claws from clutching my hiking poles. I had all the right other gear, so the rest of my body was toasty, but I couldn't move the fingers of my hands that were seemingly permanently hooked like they were holding the grip of my hiking sticks. When I made it to the town and found an inn to get some coffee and a warm breakfast, I went in to wash up. I couldn't even grip the toilet paper, my hands were so frozen. In the restaurant, I was embarrassed about making such a puddle with all my wet clothes, but the innkeepers were nonplussed. They smiled and said they were used to it. Now I was toasty and reading my trusty guide. The next 13 miles were across the most barren land of the hike. Not a house or road for 50 square miles. In this awful weather, if I had any kind of a mishap or got lost or injured, I would be in serious trouble. Plus, I was still having that knee issue. I decided to use my gray hairs and made the executive decision to use the backup plan provided by my tour company, so I took the local bus to the next destination. That was the best £4.50 I ever spent. The rest of the day was spent leisurely looking out from the ski lodge while eating delicious hot soup and enjoying hot chocolate, looking out over a massive picture window which overlooked the ski trail. This is June, and so it was now commandeered as a mountain biking trail. The smiles on the 2 young boys' faces that were biking down were just priceless. They entertained me for hours while I waited my shuttle. My right knee appreciated the time off, so the hike to Kinlochleven wasn't so bad despite climbing the Devil's Staircase. I found the view from the top of Devil's Staircase a highlight, and gratefully the weather was once again cooperating. Yes, it is straight up, and it is a bit hard, but I'm inclined to believe the story that I heard that it got its name from the builders of the stone steps up the Devil's Staircase rather than from the climbers. It's a bit difficult, but it's not killer. The view is killer, though. You can check out my video on activetraveladventures.com. Heading into the town of Kinlochleven, you'll see some massive hydroelectric tubes to your right, built, as I understand it, for an aluminum smelting business. Kinlochleven is a modest town of just over 1,000 residents, but it can boast that it was the first town in the world where every single home had electricity. When you make it to Kinlochleven, you'll find it's a cute town at the head of Loch Leven, and it's surrounded fjord-like by mountains. When there, don't miss a stop at the famous Bothy Bar in the McDonald Hotel. Coming from the U.S., where we think something is old when it's 100 years old, I find it amazing that these inns and pubs, which are centuries old, don't even bother mentioning it on their websites. I did try to look them up for you, though. When hiking this trail, you will hear and read a lot about the MacDonalds, a large and proud Scottish clan. When you've made it to Kinlochleven, you've just passed the Glencoe area, which is stunningly beautiful, is the site of the Glencoe Massacre of 1692. Infamous because 38 unarmed MacDonalds were murdered by the Earl of Argyll's regiment, which was led by Robert Campbell. And worse yet, this massacre was authorized by the government. What makes the crime seat so heinous is that this regiment had been the guests of the MacDonalds for a couple of weeks before they turned around and then killed their hosts. Here it is 300 years later, and I saw signs on some businesses saying, "No Campbell's welcome here." After Kinlochleven, we are into the home stretch of the hike into Fort William, a decent-sized town of about 10,000 residents that has all the amenities and a cute downtown on the water. Fort William is an adventure traveler's mecca. Not only is the hiking good in this area, but the mountain biking is a big attraction as well. That Great Glenway Trail that Simon continued on can also be biked, so you could hike or bike it from Fort William. While in town, it's a worthy stop to visit the West Highland Museum to learn a little bit about the history of Scotland and the clans. The original fort at Fort Williams was built in 1654, and you can see remnants of a fort on the hike into town. The trail ends in the heart of town on the pedestrian main road at the Sore Feet bronze statue, built by David A. Anand. Naming the statue Sore Feet is just another example of the Scottish humor and sensibilities. You can see my smiling face sitting next to Mr. Sore Feet at activetraveladventures.com. Many hikers add to their hike a climb of Ben Nevis, the UK's highest peak at over 4,400 feet, which is also based in Fort William. Still, I was a bit concerned about my knee, so I chose a different path. I met up again with my hiking friend Simon for dinner the night I arrived in Fort William, and then we met for coffee the next day. Afterwards, I took the famous scenic train ride to Mallaig. This picture postcard is a perfect ride. You take this extraordinarily beautiful train ride to Mallaig, have lunch, visit the museum to learn about the town's history and its importance as Western Scotland's most important commercial fishing port, walk around a little bit, and then take the train back. And yay! I found an outfitter store where I was able to buy a pair of waterproof gloves. You have two choices of trains to get to Mallaig. You can take the regular train like I did, or you can cough up a little bit more to take the historic steam train. It's almost time for the birthday party. Jamie and his friends arrived the next day. It was really cool to hang out with his friends. Granted, they're young enough to be my kids, but they seemed cool having me around. Plus, Jamie's mom, Carol, came too, so I wasn't the only one of a certain age. We were a large party, and it was hard to find a restaurant to take us to dinner without reservations. So we ended up at a Chinese restaurant that had 0 customers and made us a little nervous because all the other restaurants were packed. Gratefully, everything went well, and I was glad to see they had a lot more customers before we left. I'd been worried a little bit about food turnover and or the sanitation issues. I'm happy to report that no one got sick and we all enjoyed our meal. The next day was the big hike for Jamie's birthday. We took a train to the mountain for our climb. The weather that day was as pleasant as my clawed hand day. Bitter, raw, cold, awful, piercing rain with about 10 feet of visibility. I was so grateful for my new waterproof gloves because I was fine. My mom always told me that if you have the right clothes, it doesn't make a difference what the weather is. She is so right, folks. The funny thing about adventure travel is that when you look back, it's the things that didn't go well that you remember most fondly. I think about how I couldn't even hold that toilet paper that morning. My hands were so frozen. But I notice that I smile when I think about it or I tell the story. I think about climbing that Munro for Jamie's birthday when we were pretty much in whiteout conditions, unable to see a few feet in front of ourselves, in a bitter cold, piercing rain, where we only paused briefly for the summit photo op before racing back down the hill to get out of the rain and get warm. Yet the hike this day was one of the highlights of our adventure. I was blessed with pretty good weather on most of my trip except for the 2 days I just mentioned. I find that it's overcoming the obstacles and persevering that I remember most, and I remember most fondly. Overcoming obstacles makes me proud of myself, and I enjoy pushing myself. When we were back down the mountain, now safely warm with soup in our bellies, while we were waiting for the train back to Fort Williams, we were laughing at the cold and the rain. We cheered our endurance. We relished reliving the misery. Why is that? I don't know, but I see it time and time again on any adventure trip I take. When I look back, it's the things that went wrong or the most difficult challenges that set the adventure apart from the others and where the best stories come from. When I look back on this adventure, I smile more about that clawed hand than I do about the perfect view on the top of Conic Hill. I think it must do with us pushing ourselves, enduring the challenges, and then triumphing. People who choose to do adventure travel for their vacations are different than most people. We seem to have this odd pat ourselves in the back for overcoming the challenges mentality. We actually thrive on it a little bit. We get dirty and we get sweaty and we're often uncomfortable and sometimes even in a little pain. My family doesn't understand why I do it. Some friends seem envious, but they wouldn't do something like this. If you're listening to this, I'm betting that you're one of my people and you get it. I'm so glad that you do. My takeaway of hiking the West Highland Way in Scotland is that this is a doable hike for almost anyone in decent shape. You can do it self-guided like I did, you can plan your own adventure, and even backpack the trip like my new friend Simon did. Although when he heard about how I had the luggage transfer, he wished he'd done that as well. It's a very popular hike, and accommodations in these small villages are limited, so you do need to plan well in advance. Be sure to download the free West Highland Way cheat sheet you can find at activetraveladventures.com. The cheat sheets that I do for each episode contain some of the nitty-gritty details, plus my recommendations and tips for the trip. If you subscribe to the newsletter, you'll get it automatically in the next issue, so you can file it in your computer or print it out and put it in your dream book. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the podcast. If you don't know how to, visit any page on the Active Travel Adventures website to find a link that will show you how. If you have subscribed, you're one of the early adopters that understands this new technology. Most people today still don't even know what a podcast is. How about doing me the honor and the favor of grabbing a friend's phone this week and subscribing them to the Active Travel Adventures podcast so you can enlighten them on this cool new tool called a podcast. Thank you so much. I'm really grateful. At any time, I hope you'll email me at kit@activetraveladventures.com to tell me about your adventures. I love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. Until next time, adventure on.